It's a pleasure to welcome everyone here tonight. I'm Jane Tylis, Director of the Humanities Initiative at NYU. When my good colleague and friend Dale Jamieson approached me, I think late last spring, about the new book that you're going to hear about tonight, I was delighted and said without hesitation, yes, we must do a book launch sometime this fall. And when I received my copy, I think the first page I opened it to, as I said to Dale earlier this evening, there were lots of graphs and numbers and words like economics. And, for a moment, I felt that disorientation. I felt as a high school senior, failing the math part of the SATs, and was wondering why we're talking about this book in the Humanities Initiative. But on further browsing, and it certainly didn't take long, it became abundantly clear that this is a major work that does what all good humanists should do, which is to interrogate other fields of learning in the sciences and the social sciences, and that really brings together a number of scholars whose work cuts across a number of disciplines in the interest of that fragile thing called our environment and our climate. And on a day like today, the end of October, as we're all walking around in shorts and T-shirts, we realize the necessity for a book such as this and for a panel of the experts who are joining us here tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator, who will be introducing the panelists. That is Professor Dick Stewart, who is the John Sexton Professor of Law at the Law School here at NYU. He also is the director of the Frank J. Guarini Center of Environmental Law and Land Use here at NYU. And he will introduce the panelists. They will jump into a discussion of the book, and then we look forward to your own questions and interventions at the end of the evening as we celebrate climate ethics, essential readings just out in paperback, as you can see outside, from Oxford University Press.
Very good. So I've been involved in this climate business since roughly 1989, when I was in the government and federal government and responsible for a major role of the Bush 41 administration. Remember those good old days? Right up to the Rio Climate Conference. And, there's been episodic publications, many by the authors here, in the field of climate ethics. But bringing this together in this book is a real landmark and a real service. And it's hard to think of a more important and more timely set of ethical issues than those posed by climate change. And so we're going to have a brief discussion by the three authors here of the some of the basic themes and issues and contentions in the book, and then we will open it up for discussion. And we're going to go in the order of Dale Jamieson first, who's known to many of you, teaching philosophy, environmental studies, environmental ethics here at NYU, including in the law school, where he's a very valued colleague teaching our law students about environmental ethics and with focus on a variety of issues, but including climate change. Then we're going to be followed by Henry Shue, an old colleague of mine too many years ago at Oxford, and who's first wrote about climate change in 1992. And then Stephen Gardiner, based at the University of Washington in Seattle, who is coined the provocative title of A Perfect Moral Storm. So we will go in that order and start with Dale.
Thanks, Dick, and thank all of you for coming out to help us celebrate this book. In 1988, I gave my first talk on climate ethics at a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in New Orleans. And by that time, a lot was already known about climate science. In fact, you could even argue that almost all of the basic essentials that we needed to know about climate science was known by then. But there was still this feeling that, going back to the famous 1957 paper by Ravel and Cease, that what we were doing was witnessing a kind of experiment. We didn't really know what the results of that would be. That feeling was still very much in the air, but there was increasingly this sense of trepidation that this was an issue that we were going to have to begin to think seriously about how to respond. Not a lot was known really about the impacts of climate change at that time. In 1988, the EPA put out a report on the impacts of climate change on the United States. That report didn't talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It only talked about how we might adapt to climate change. And when it came to the field of climate ethics, there was really virtually nothing that existed at that point. I think there were probably people like Henry staying up late at night in Ithaca, New York, maybe thinking about those issues. But in terms of a literature, there really wasn't much that existed. And since then, the field has developed in fits and starts. And we've seen a kind of steady, if sporadic, growth of interest in that field. In this last decade, the first decade of this century after Al Gore lost his race for the presidency, he began to talk about climate change as a moral issue, and I think what he was wanting to do was to distinguish it from a political issue. He wanted to say, look, this is an issue we should all be concerned to address, whatever our politics may be. And R.K. Pachauri, the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also began to talk about climate change as a moral issue, really in the run-up to the IPCC winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And from Gore and Pachauri, the kind of moralizing of the climate change issue, I think, began to spread out, and we began to hear all kinds of people, from politicians to bartenders, beginning to talk about climate change as an ethical or as a moral issue. In many cases, they, I think, would have something very different in mind. For some people, climate change was a moral issue because they saw it as an issue of polluters essentially causing harms to vulnerable people. Other people saw climate change as a moral issue because they saw the actions that the United States government might take to reduce emissions as violating some moral norms or some moral standards. But one of the things that was a little disconcerting, I think, during the whole development of this area is how much ignorance there seemed to be of the fact that there actually had been people addressing issues of climate ethics and climate justice in a relatively systematic way for some years, and that this was in fact a field in which scholarship was growing. So increasingly we began to see people talk about climate ethics, but sort of, in a kind of vacuum, as if I would be talking about physics without ever really having it occur to me that there was actually a discipline of physics. Now, I think in all honesty, it is hard to move around in literatures with which one isn't acquainted. We're all kind of victims of our education, and when we begin to try to move out and move into more interdisciplinary areas, it's difficult to do that. And it's also true that I think a lot of the work in climate ethics and climate politics were published in obscure places, even by the standards of their home disciplines. But I think there's still a kind of certain amount of laziness or disbelief that there is actually a real field of climate ethics or climate justice here. So I think to some extent the way this volume started was Simon, who unfortunately couldn't be here, Steve and Henry and I, sitting around some bar somewhere some night, sort of complaining that there was all this work out here, but it didn't really seem to be as well known in the kind of broader climate science, climate studies community as it should be known. So we decided then to produce this book to bring together a lot of the literature under two covers, so at the very least there could no longer be this excuse that people didn't actually know that there was a literature out here. We now actually have something we can hand to people when they say, "Oh, really? Climate ethics? Are there really people working on that topic?" Now, the subtitle of the book is Essential Readings, and it's important that it doesn't say the essential readings because since we put together this volume, in fact, important contributions are being made, I think, really kind of at an exponential pace now, and by a much broader community of people than were working in the field when we began to put the book together. And so if this book goes into a second edition, it will certainly include it will be more inclusive, I think, of topics and authors that are not in this edition of the book. I think it's important to recognize that the issues of climate ethics don't just concern what in the trade is called mitigation, that is, reducing emissions, but also includes questions about adaptation and who's going to pay for the necessary adaptations to climate change, to which we're all committed. And increasingly, we're also going to have to think from a moral and ethical point of view about questions of geoengineering, which, as the nations of the world demonstrate increasingly that they are incapable of really addressing this problem, then the case for geoengineering and the interest in geoengineering climate begins to grow. And so those are issues that are going to have to be addressed in terms of our values and our norms. Now, Henry and Steve will be giving you, I think briefly, but nevertheless, their own substantive takes on some issues of climate ethics. And so I'm just going to use the remainder of my time really to just make one very broad point, which I think is a point that I'm not sure that we all agree with, but I think it's important to articulate. And it stems from the question, why is it that we have failed to act on climate change? Now, if we look at the history of the subject, we see the development of climate science in terms of the basic principles being understood more than a century ago. In the 1950s, there were articles about climate change in the New York Times. I mean, we can trace an amazingly rich history. But still, we haven't acted on this issue. Why is that? Well, I think there's a lot of reasons why we haven't acted. I mean, Mother Nature built us to deal with saber-toothed tigers. Mother Nature didn't build us to deal with molecules of carbon emissions. We can't see them, we can't touch them, we can't taste them, they're cumulative and so on. I think the problem of climate change has also exposed some difficulties in our systems of governance, including our political systems and our systems of international order. It's also clear that there are a lot of bad actors out there, that there are people who vilify climate scientists, that lie about the science and do so for individual or for corporate gain. All of that is true, but I think there's a deeper problem which helps to explain why we haven't responded to this problem successfully. And that's because I think our systems of ethics and public decision-making, for example, economics, that have evolved in different social circumstances and under different conditions, dealing with different kinds of problems, are really not adequate for thinking about problems such as climate change. And so, in my view, there's a profound difference between the sort of problem that climate change is and some other problems of social change, such as questions of race and questions of sex, and even questions of animal rights. In those cases, it involves taking some relatively traditional and relatively well understood moral principles and seeing that they apply to new cases, and indeed that they had always applied to those cases. It's just that because of questions of moral blindness or prejudice, we had not been able to see their application. But I think with climate change, we're going to have to come to see acts that traditionally we regard as innocent or innocuous, driving an SUV to school to pick up the kids after soccer practice, setting the thermostat at 70 instead of 68. Climate change challenges us to moralize those kinds of actions and to see tiny, imperceptible contributions to global bads as being actions that have a moral valence. And so I think climate change then really challenges us to revise and extend our moral concepts. And that also, I think, explains in part why it's so difficult to make the case for why we should act aggressively with respect to climate change. If it were just simply a matter of there being clear moral wrongs that people resist doing the right thing in response to, that would be one thing. But I think what climate change really challenges us to do is to say to people, it's not that we're saying that picking up your kids from school or turning up your thermostat is a clear moral wrong, like killing your mother or strangling your father. But we're actually asking people to say, you ought to revise your ethical system in such a way as to see these things as constituting wrongs and harms. And so the argument for that, I think, is a very different kind of argument, a much more subtle and a much more difficult kind of argument than in the normal case of giving moral arguments. Now, I suspect that Henry and Steve, to some extent, disagree with this claim, and it's, I think, an interesting disagreement. But nevertheless, I think it's important to at least consider the possibility that part of what makes climate change such a hard problem is that it poses such a profound challenge to all the systems of governance, both formal and informal, with which we've evolved in our societies. So, thanks.
Thank you, Dale. Henry will be the next speaker. Henry?
Thanks. Well, in his quiet, modest way, Dale suggested that maybe we don't all agree, and we actually don't, which is part of the fun. I want to talk about some aspects of climate change that I think are dealt with by some of our old familiar moral principles. This doesn't necessarily mean that anything Dale just said about our needing to extend and revise is wrong, but I do want to emphasize that I think we can get some of the way with quite familiar things. We certainly need to radically change our behavior, but the question's to what extent the old principles work. I'm doing this because I think a lot of people have the view that to deal with climate change, one needs to do scientific analysis and legal analysis, think about laws and treaties, and economic analysis, figure out the costs and so on. If you're interested in ethics, you could also do some ethical analysis, but that part's discretionary. And of course, the sort of person who thought the ethics was discretionary might think reading our book was discretionary. What I want to suggest is that the ethics isn't discretionary. Unfortunately, our book may still be discretionary, although there are not that many books just like this. But anyway, now since climate change is caused by so-called greenhouse gases getting caught in our atmosphere, one of the crucial scientific parameters is what the scientists call the residence time of the greenhouse gases. That is, how long do they stay in the atmosphere once they're there. Dale and I started this game about the same time, although I do have to concede seniority to Dale by a few years. But anyway, at that time, if you looked up the various greenhouse gases and looked to see what was said about carbon dioxide, you were told that its atmospheric residence time, how long it stayed up there once it got there, was about a century. And I can remember thinking, wow, that's really a long time. Let me read you a paragraph from the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the fourth assessment report from 2007. I can give the reference to anybody who wants it. This is sort of industrial strength stuff, but I'll try to say what difference I think it makes. Quote, an atmospheric lifetime for carbon dioxide cannot be defined. The behavior of carbon dioxide is completely different from the trace gases with well-defined lifetimes. Stabilization of carbon dioxide emissions at current levels would result in a continuous increase of atmospheric carbon dioxide over the 21st century and beyond. In fact, only in the case of essentially complete elimination of emissions can the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide ultimately be stabilized at a constant level. More specifically, the rate of emission of carbon dioxide currently greatly exceeds its rate of removal, and the slow and incomplete removal implies that small to moderate reductions in its emissions would not result in the stabilization of carbon dioxide concentrations, but rather would only reduce the rate of the concentration's growth in coming decades, end quote. I think that translates as, it's the stocks, stupid. It's not the flows, but the stocks. That is, we talk about, oh, maybe we'll reduce carbon emissions by 25%. How about 40%, 80%? If there's a plug in the drain of a bathtub and you're running water into the bathtub, then the tub's going to overflow. And if you run the water in more slowly, it'll overflow more slowly. But as long as you're running water in, it keeps overflowing. And what this paragraph is saying about the carbon is it's being removed so slowly, and it has such a long lifetime, so long that it can't, with any precision, be calculated, that for all practical purposes, every addition of carbon to the atmosphere is a net addition, because any subtraction that's occurring is occurring so slowly that it might as well not be occurring. It might as well be that there's a unleaking plug in the bathtub. Now, this is really quite mind-boggling, I think, because it means that any further additions of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere are going to be there for something on the order of 1,000 years. And they're going to just make the amount in the atmosphere continue to expand. What does this mean from an ethical point of view? Well, first of all, it means we must very quickly stop adding greenhouse gases. Even if we had no special responsibility at all ourselves, we need to act because action needs to be taken very soon. So here's the first ethical thing, and this is the weakest, but I mean it's a sort of Good Samaritan style thing. Why should we act? Why did the Good Samaritan have to get the guy out of the ditch? He wasn't his brother. He hadn't promised to help him. He didn't know him. Why was he supposed to do something? Because he was there. We're here. Somebody needs to do something to slow down the carbon emissions. We would need to do that because it needs to be done now, even if we had no special responsibility. Now, that's a relatively weak ethical consideration, although I think it's a real one. But we don't need to agonize about how weak it is because we do have special responsibility. The other thing that I think flows directly out of this picture of what the situation is we are harming the people to come. We are making the future worse. And so the question isn't, would you like to help future generations? Would you like to, rescue them? They're facing this problem. You could help them. The question is, are you going to stop creating the problem? Are you going to stop making it worse? And if there's one really fundamental principle that practically everybody agrees with, it's do no harm. Don't make people's lives worse off. And that's exactly what we're doing. We didn't want to. We didn't, for a long time, know that we were. Now we know. I mean, that's one thing that's happened just over the course of our lifetimes. We've been contributing to global warming since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Most of that time, we didn't know it. How much that matters is another question. I actually don't think it matters all that much. But anyway, now we know. And so now we're continuing to do it in full knowledge that we're doing it. So it seems to me we're violating this very fundamental and pretty indisputable principle of do no harm. Now, forgot to check when I saw it shut me down when I need to be shut down if I don't stop. Some atmospheric physicists at Oxford have recently done a really interesting calculation that has to do with what's called the trillionth ton. There's a bit of very general logic. If you choose a target for how much warming you're willing to tolerate, let's say you say we'll limit global warming to 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. So that's our target. Then it's a relatively, it's an empirical question, and it's relatively straightforward, but not fully straightforward, how much more greenhouse gas you can emit and still keep that ceiling. So you can choose the ceiling. You can aim for 1.5, you can aim for 2, you can aim for 3, but once you've chosen your target, it's not up to you or us how much more we can emit. That'll be determined by the dynamics of the planetary system. What these physicists have calculated is lots of people now are saying, let's limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. What they've calculated is that that means total cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide mustn't exceed 1 trillion tons. Cumulative, partly because it stays there so long. So in effect, as you add, you're just building up the total. It's not, the very little is going away. It took 250 years to emit the first 500 billion, but at current emission rates, we'll do the other 500 billion in less than 40 years. So if we're serious about climate not warming more than 2 degrees, within the next 40 years, for those of you who are young, student-ish age here, before you retire, we have to have finished emitting carbon dioxide. So we have to have finished burning coal, oil, and gas. I realize this probably strikes some people as insane, but I'm telling you what follows from the problem. If we mustn't emit the trillionth ton, then we mustn't emit into the atmosphere. We can emit whatever can be recycled, but we're of course going much faster than that. Beyond the trillionth ton, and at the rate we're going, that'll be done within the next 40 years. Okay. So what does that mean, Marley? It means that there's a fixed remaining amount of carbon dioxide emissions, which is zero sum across all succeeding generations and all nations. So the problem of what to do about climate change is a problem of intergenerational distribution and international distribution. And this is not some other, interesting philosophical problem. This is the problem, because we are now competing with our own grandchildren for the remaining budget of emissions that's compatible with any ceiling on what a reasonable amount of warming will be. Should I stop there? Maybe I will.
A few more.
Okay, well, the next, all right, there's a fourth one that's, the way we're going to deal with
I
this.
hope it's not getting worse.
Well, I'm afraid it is, but the way we're going to deal with this is going to be trading in emissions, right? So we have another 500 billion tons we can trade. The way this is supposed to work, of course, is we encourage the development of alternative fuels and we discourage the use of carbon fuels by driving up the price of the fossil fuels, right? So if we do this seriously, fossil fuels are going to get more and more expensive. But there are poor people who now can't afford the fossil fuel they need. If we don't develop alternative energy and the price just keeps going up, there are going to be more and more poor people who are going to have trouble paying for the petrol for their irrigation pumps and the fertilizer for their crops and so on. So as we approach our ceiling, we don't want to go over the trillionth ton. We're going to get into this position where we say, we mustn't exceed the ceiling, but these poor people need energy, and the only energy we've got for them is fossil energy, so we'll have to let them have a little more. Well, if we let them have a little more, we're going to go over the ceiling. Okay, well, the other thing we can say is we mustn't go over the ceiling, so they don't get any more. But, I mean, you're really proposing starving them, making their life very difficult at that point. So you're really pitting the current poor at this slightly later time against the future poor. For the future poor, you need to keep the ceiling. For the current poor, you need to give them a little slack. The great thing we can do is avoid that problem. If we develop alternative fuels fast enough, we don't get into that pickle. We don't put them in that pickle. We don't pit the future poor against the then living poor, because there is an alternative. The alternative is fossil fuels. So the final moral thing here is not one of these, bad, don't harm them. It's here's a chance where we can do something absolutely morally wonderful. We can transform the situation. We can give people a legacy in which they can have decent lives and in which the poor of different generations don't have to compete with each other because they're not dependent on fossil fuel. But that depends on our getting going now on alternative energy.
Thank you very much. And finally, Stephen.
Okay, hello. Well, I was aware that I'd probably be going last here and was a little worried that profound thoughts would be put before you and all your mental capacity would be used up at this point. So here's what I thought I would do. In the book in particular, you'll find some very difficult questions raised, some very complicated arguments. But philosophers also love metaphors and examples. And often, I think the best way to get people interested in what philosophers are doing is to tell them about the metaphors and examples first, so that maybe they're primed to think about some of the more detailed arguments. So I want to tell you about a few of these. First two concern the nature of the problem and the climate problem. And the first one, I have to admit, I'm responsible for myself, and that's the metaphor of the perfect moral storm. So in this metaphor, I liken our situation, humanity's situation, as being like that of the crew of the fishing boat, the Andrea Gale, hit by three major storms at the same time, right? Large, unprecedented sorts of storms. Sorry. Now I totally lost my thread. And for us, the problem is that these storms, their convergence, threatens to throw us seriously off course in terms of ethical action. Right? And I think these three storms are the global dimension of the problem. It's a genuinely global problem. You need cooperation of all nations, really, to solve it. That's the familiar analysis. The intergenerational dimension, which is a lot less familiar, and which I'll say a bit more in a second, and the theoretical dimension, where that means that this topic, climate change, involves the intersection of a number of areas where our theoretical approaches are not highly developed and arguably not up to the task of bearing the strain. So I particularly want to emphasize the intergenerational aspect of the problem. And one of the reasons for this is usually we think of it as a problem that's global, that's to be solved by nations sorting out together how they're going to address it at a particular time. But we do that under the assumption that those nations are representing the interests of their citizens in perpetuity across time. And I think in this context, that's a very dangerous assumption. It's a dangerous assumption because of the severe time lags in the system. The worst things that we think might happen are probably, decades, maybe even a century or so off from where we are right now. So we engage in all these activities that produce carbon, and we get benefits from those in the short term. But the cost, the really nasty costs especially, look as though they're further out, which means they're not to us. And when we conceive of the problem as just in the spatial dimension of a global problem and as countries negotiating about what to do about it to solve the problem, we miss the fact that those countries are, by and large, representing the interests of people who are around now, who are enjoying those benefits, those short-term benefits. Right? And there's no particular reason to think that they're very good at representing the interests of their citizens in perpetuity in the year 2100, 2200, and so on. And I think, as a side note, that this has a significant impact on how we think about environmental problems more generally. We're so used to the metaphor of the tragedy of the commons, that Garrett Hardin gave us, where the herdsmen are grazing their flocks on the commons and they inflict tragedy on themselves collectively through their behavior. And they all agree that this is a tragedy. And so there's the first step towards solution, because they all agree the situation is tragic because it's bad for them, for their own herds. But this case, I argue, is different. It's not obvious, given the big time delays, that this is a nice tragedy of the commons where we all agree that everything's going badly from our point of view and we should stop. The worrying thing from the moral point of view is that we think, well, from our point of view, the current generation, it's not that bad a thing. In fact, there are nice short-term benefits and so on, and maybe we'll outlive anything really bad and be able to spend our way out of the bad things that come during the next few decades. Right? And that is a very difficult problem. And given that it's that problem, the tragedy of the commons problem, that motivates a lot of contemporary political theory and economic thinking and so on around these topics, I find it worrying. I think we've got the wrong problem. Anyway, that was one metaphor, the perfect moral storm. I have a lot more to say about that. Another influential metaphor is one of Dale's, right, which he uses to motivate this idea of where responsibility is. He says that climate change is very different from a paradigm case of moral wrong, like Jones stealing Smith's television, or more recently Dale's been saying Jack intentionally stealing Jill's bicycle. Instead, Dale tells us that climate change is more like this. Acting independently, Jack and a large number of unacquainted people set in motion a chain of events that causes a large number of future people who will live in another part of the world from ever having bicycles. And he goes on to argue that it's not really surprising that given this disconnect between the normal case and the climate case, that many people don't see climate change as a moral problem. And they at least if they do see it as a moral problem, they don't see it as having the same urgency as a problem like Jack stealing Jill's bicycle. So at one point he memorably says, "Today we face the possibility that the global environment may be destroyed, yet no one will be responsible." Think about that. The global environment will be destroyed and no one will be responsible on our conventional notions of what it takes to be responsible. And Dale says this is a new problem, and you might think a rather serious one. So leaving that metaphor in your mind of Jack and Jill on the bicycle. When it comes to what to do, deciding what ought to be done and who ought to take the primary burdens, at least in the short to medium term, about climate change, there is, because we're talking about philosophers after all, a surprising consensus, right, around the idea that it is the richer developed nations, and in particular the world's richer people, that have the primary responsibility. But there you also see some metaphors, some very commonplace, that help us think about it. Peter Singer tells us that we in the rich countries should take responsibility for the fact that we're clogging up the climate bathtub. Right? We should clean up our own mess. Simple idea, but gets you thinking in the right way. Henry Shue reminds us that even in an emergency, one pawns the jewelry before selling the blankets. And so he argues, whatever justice may require, it doesn't permit that the poor nations be told to sell their blankets, that's compromise their development strategies, in order that the rich nations can keep their jewelry. Right? Another memorable metaphor. And when it comes to implementation, there are also memorable metaphors. Bob Gooden discusses whether economic instruments such as permits to pollute or green taxes are morally kin to the old practice of the Catholic Church of selling indulgences. Sin and be forgiven, just have your wallet ready, is an ethically worrying proposition, so Bob says in the book. And there are some interesting metaphors as well when talking about responsibility. I've already said that Dale thinks there's a large problem there, but other people have also waded in different ways. Peter Singer has told us that the case for sanctions against nations who fail to cooperate in addressing climate change is strong. In fact, he argues that it's much stronger than it was in the case of South Africa. Since as bad as apartheid was, it involves South Africa committing injustice against its own citizens, not foisting it on the rest of the world. That's a very serious claim to make. Second sort of metaphor, but tending in an interesting, different direction, Walter Sinner Armstrong asks whether people have a moral obligation not to take Sunday drives in their Hummers just for the fun of it. And he comes to the really surprising conclusion that they don't. Part of his reason is he thinks that the climate problem is essentially political, and he uses a metaphor to motivate this thought. If a bridge needs fixing, it's the government's job to fix it, he says, not mine. But even if they're not fixing it, this doesn't mean that I have an obligation to do so, or even to do my share by going out in the middle of the night and nailing on a few planks to the bridge. Right? Now, this argument is highly contentious, and of course what Walter really thinks is that our obligations here are primarily political. And Dale disagrees with him about that in interesting ways. But I think thinking about the metaphors can help. So the last metaphor I want to mention again is one of mine. I've argued that one value that seems to be on people's minds when lamenting inaction on climate change concerns the collective ethical failure of particular societies and indeed humanity as a whole. For example, some scientists seem to take the latest shift towards the pursuit of geoengineering as a sign that as a species we have failed to meet a basic challenge. I think the thought goes something like this. Humanity is, in geological and evolutionary terms, a recent arrival on the planet and is currently undergoing an amazingly rapid expansion in terms of sheer population numbers, technological capabilities, and environmental impact. A basic question that faces us as humans, then, is whether amidst all this, we can meet the challenge of adapting to the planet on which we live. In this context, the decision to geoengineer might be taken to show that we have, to a significant extent, failed. More specifically, suppose the basic idea is that, as a species, we already had a perfectly serviceable planet to live on, and now we're undermining that. We have, in elementary terms, fouled the nest. We could clean it up. That would be the most direct approach, the one most likely to work. But so intent are we on continuing our messy habits that we will pursue any means to avoid that, even those that impose huge risks on others and involve further alienation from nature. In this case, so the thought goes, the decision to geoengineer constitutes the crossing of a new threshold on the spectrum of environmental recklessness, and thereby embodies a new recognition of our continued and deepening failure. So on this view, it's natural to think that it will be a sad and shameful day in the life of humanity when such a decision is made, and you might add, even if in some sense it's a necessary decision. So, what I've just tried to do is to pique your curiosity about climate ethics by throwing out some interesting metaphors in play in the discussion. There are many others I could have mentioned and which you can find in the book. Much of what is at stake in climate change is, of course, complicated, but perhaps talk about storms, bicycles, bathtubs, jewelry, indulgences, fouling the nest, and so on, can help us find one way into it. I hope that's not too sobering for a celebration like this one, and if so, I invite you outside afterwards to raise a glass to thank NYU and our hosts today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you have three very arresting, succinct, and powerful sort of summaries or excerpts, if I should say, of the material in this book, and that has certainly whet your appetite to buy the book, which will be available afterwards, and get into more detail. In order to get the discussion going, just with the panel, and then I'll shortly open it up, I want to pick up on the issue that Dale raised at the beginning. Do we need a new ethics for this? I guess in my own view, I think almost any normative framework, including welfare economics, the answer to this question is overdetermined. So what we have to do, I think it's been very clear, at least for 20 years, dealing with risk and principles of insurance, and now we can see the whites in their eyes. And we only have 40 years, Henry tells us. Can we have a new ethics in 40 years? How do we? What's the role of ethics in motivating changes in individual or political behavior? Al Gore preached the message, and that turned on the converted or people likely to be converted, but at least half the people in the country are turned off by it. So how as effective is the ethical invocation to get the job done that we need? Is it a new ethics, or, and here I'm totally outside my depth in talking about the aspects of cognitive psychology that deal with ethical behavior. I mean, I guess I would maybe say to Dale, can't the good old ethics do, but how do we adapt our perceptions, our processing, our gestalt, our framing, that to hook up with our ethical, received ethical notions in new circumstances, and can we do it in a fast enough way? Now, one way to do it is to frame the issue as Henry did with a couple of examples, and I think Stephen did in some other respects, to say, now I see it in a new light, and now I see it as something that then triggers the normative apparatus that we have. Or do we need a new ethic? Now, Dale says we're each causing this harm, and we have an individual responsibility. And that raises the question of, institutions with respect to ethics. We normally say, for many problems that are collective action problems, that we rely on the government as an institution to coordinate Social Security, some degree foreign aid, and so forth. And don't we really need that here? The political solution. Can we really expect to be sustainable as a norm of behavior to ask people to say, if you keep the thermostat at 70, if you drive a car, you're causing harm and you're morally reprehensible. Is that really a sustainable appeal to behavior? So last issue I want to raise, to make progress at the time frame we do we have to abandon ethics for self-interest? Is that going to drive competitiveness? This is what's driving the Chinese and a lot of people in Europe. Other appeals to self-interest, that resource efficiency is critical from an international economic competition, from a welfare viewpoint. That, of course, is what the president tried to do to sell his climate bill to win over the marginal votes. Or what is the relation between appeals to self-interest and ethical appeals? If we rely solely on ethics and a sort of either transformation in the ethics or the, as I say, the cognitive understandings or processing that would support either an old or new ethics to solve this problem, are we way too late? So what's the applied dimension here of the ethics that are being discussed so cogently in this book? So I'll pose that to anybody in the panel who wants to respond.
Well, I might as well start by saying I think in some important sense our goose is cooked, and in a way that's the problem. So in a way, I mean, I start thinking about these issues in a way almost from a kind of the sort of like I'm doing an autopsy at this point. I mean, there has been a failure. We are committed to a really extreme degree of warming. The challenge we face is to minimize the extremity of that degree of warming to the greatest extent possible. To cope with the warming, so adaptation and geoengineering are really now central as far as I'm concerned, and also to try to learn from our mistakes. So at this point, I really don't think anything is soon enough, whether it's ethics or government or whatever it may be. So that's the first point. The second point is I tend to see ethics actually as continuous, really, with law and policy. And I think of moral systems as systems of informal regulation that are then built upon in the creation of other kinds of norms and so on. So I don't think of institutional control and institution building as being in opposition to the development of ethical and moral norms. So I think we need development at both of these levels, and I think we'll only get development at one level if we get development at the other level. The other comment that I would make is really about economics, which I think of as being at the heart of public decision making. And part of the problem here is that we really don't know how to think on the timescales which climate change requires us to think on. I mean, we're talking about harms that are going to occur to people who live in the next century and in the centuries beyond that and the centuries beyond that. We don't know, I mean, just from a moral point of view, we don't know who those people are. We don't know what their preferences will be. We don't know how much other social change will be occurring in those centuries. I mean, Tom Schelling likes to tell these kinds of stories about imagine that the year was 1900 and you were trying to imagine what the lives of people would be like in the year 2000. Even a profound global warming of a couple of degrees centigrade, 1 to 2 degrees centigrade over that century, may actually not even be the most striking thing that you might notice over the course of that century compared to the development of jet airplanes and nuclear weapons, for example. So when we're required to think that many centuries out in the future, I just don't think any of our conceptual systems are up to it. And I'm not going to go into a big discussion about discounting now in economics and the discount rate. But the problem that we have is that the paradigm economic systems we have for thinking about the future, in their core cases, are really about individuals scheduling their consumption over a single lifetime. And when we move to lifetimes that go out a century or 2 centuries in the future, and we talk about not a single individual scheduling consumption over a lifetime, but figuring out how to distribute that consumption over many individuals, that way of making decisions just falls apart. So I think at this point, climate economics is not really very helpful because the difference between Stern and Nordhaus, for example, for those of you who are involved in this discussion, is primarily the difference of a value judgment about how to value future people. So I think we're inevitably thrown back and trying to identify what our core values are and thinking about this issue.
Okay. I think it's quite conceivable that we don't have a lot of time left, and we've already done some things that are pretty bad, and it's only going to get worse. And it might be that discussion of ethics is relatively impotent in the wider world to do something about that. But one thing I want to make clear from the start is, in my view, that wouldn't necessarily show there was anything wrong with the ethics. Sometimes ethical concerns don't have the effect on the agents that confront them that you'd hope. We don't always say that there's something wrong with the ethics. Sometimes we say these were just not very nice people, right? So that's just by way of saying I wouldn't automatically conclude from the fact that we have strong reasons perhaps to feel that ethics isn't going to solve this problem for us on the time scale necessary, that there was anything wrong with the ethics. And here I take myself perhaps to be disagreeing more with the spirit of Dick's question than with Dale's position. I do think incentives matter at the individual level and at the level of firms and so on. And so that whatever policy that you wanted to put in place to do something would have to take that very seriously, and in particular take seriously that those sorts of institutions, individual consumption and the behavior of firms, respond to very short-term kinds of considerations most of the time. So if you were going to do something about climate change, you'd have to take that very seriously. And Dick would be right about that, I'm sure. However, I do think that at a higher level, our reason for putting in place such systems that manipulate those local incentives in the right sort of way, in the green sort of direction, you might say, are going to have to be ethical. Right? And that's partly because I think it's a perfect moral storm, and because I think the intergenerational dimension is so strong, right? If you really just have a very narrow set of motivations, right, towards the short term and what we perceive to be in our narrow self-interest, then I don't see why we would do much about this problem. Right? There's a reason why very mainstream conventional economic analysis tells you shouldn't really do very much about this problem, right? In my view. That being said, I don't think that we should disparage any attempts to do something about alternative energy and so on, as Henry was talking about, to try and change the incentives on the ground in that way, even from the point of view of those narrow short-term economic thoughts. But one thing I am worried about is that, I mean, my perception is, by the way, that it's not the case that ethics is going to gum up the works and stop it happening, right? We've had quite a while to do something about it, and most of that time we've been trying to convince people that it's in their interest to do this and so on. And, you know, some things have happened, but we haven't seen a dramatic switch in the way we'd like. The moral problem that I think comes along is if you say, well, we need a green energy revolution because that's the only game in town. It's only because if people can be persuaded that it is strongly in their interest to make this change that anything will happen. That might be descriptively true, but I think it would show what I said earlier, that we're actually pretty bad people, if that's the case. The view that I subscribe to is I'm hopeful about alternative energy, and I do think we should pursue it and hope that it changes the incentives. But I just think they'll be lucky for us if it turns out to be strongly in our interest to make the change anyway. My position is that pretty much we've got to do it anyway, even if we have to take some pretty serious hits ourselves in our generation in order to make the transformation. We've got to do it because otherwise we are inflicting profound harms and injustices on the poor, future generations, and nature.
Henry, you want to?
Okay, there's some very intelligent-looking faces out here, so I'm willing to bet that somebody out there is going to say something smart if we give them a chance. But one thought about getting the self-interest and the morality together. One thing that we can do is that the people who actually care morally can design institutions which will work even for the people who don't care and who are just pursuing their own interest. And so one thing we need is that kind of institution, and that this is really what emissions trading is about. I don't by any means think emissions trading is our total salvation, but the acid rain trading's actually worked amazingly well. Dick knows much more about this than I do, but so, and I mean, the idea is the people who actually care about the future generations set the thing up so that the people who are just trying to pursue their own interest have to do the right thing. You structure the institution so that you channel the interest. So one little bit of comfort, I think, is it's not necessary that everybody be morally concerned. What's necessary is that the morally concerned people be smart enough to figure out the institutions that will channel the other people into doing what needs to be done, even though they don't particularly care. Now, I already mentioned institutions. The thing that the sort of new thing that I think we need, as I've sort of said already, is not so much new principles as just imagination about how we proceed, and in particular, imagination about institutions. So one thing we need is, imaginative ways of making use of fossil fuel too expensive. The other thing we need, and I have nothing concrete and useful to say about this, but we need imaginative ways of provoking and stimulating and incentivizing technological innovation to get us the alternative fuels. And again, it's partly you can harness self-interest. I mean, some people are going to make a lot of money with alternative fuels. Maybe they're all going to be Chinese. Okay, fine. I don't care. I mean, I already missed my chance to get rich. But I mean, if somebody can get rich, kind coming up with alternative fuels, great. Let's just do what we can to make that happen. And of course, the two things work together. The better we can make the price of fossil fuels rise, and the better we can bring down the price of the alternative fuels, the sooner we'll get the crossover where the people who don't care about the problem but who just don't want to spend too much money will be buying the alternative fuels. So we need institutional innovation and technological innovation, which I think means we need a lot of imagination. We need some people who care, but we don't have to wait for, all of humanity to be converted and all of humanity to care about the future. But those of us who do care about the future need to get our thinking caps on and get our acts together and get going. And I think the kind of moaning about how serious it all is that we all tend to do, but I'm surely the most guilty of, is just a way of saying, let's get going. I mean, it's not a way of saying maybe our goose is cooked. Our goose is getting very hot, but maybe the goose can still crawl out of there yet if we hit her with enough cold water. I mean,
So it just reminds me.
We need better metaphors.
Well, it just reminds me, Henry, about 4 or 5 years ago, I was on sabbatical. I was in Rome for a year, and the neighbor was the financial guy for Exxon in the Mediterranean. He said, "Yeah, you're totally right about this. Opera nulla deluge. Let's let it burn, baby, right. Burn." So we hope we have a more constructive response. So let's open it up to the audience now. Are we going to use the microphone here? What do you want? We don't need a microphone. All right. Then I ask people to stand up, please, and speak loudly so we can hear you, and ask your question. Yes, sir.
I think they're right, but I think that politically it doesn't work very well. I mean, the issue, I think, at the heart of the international negotiations is precisely what you just said, that the developing countries say, you owe us, and we say, no, we don't. And that's where it is. And I actually think they're right. I mean, I do think we created the problem and we owe them, but I also think it's going to be a, cold day in hell when we agree. So, I think we've got to get around that, and one way of getting around it is to look. And I was trying to do this before. Look at where we've got to get and ask what various ones of us can reasonably contribute. Now, the built into the reasonably contribute, of course, is that we are wealthier than they are. I think. They're entitled to some development. So besides saying, we owe them because we caused the problem, I mean, the other thing one can just say is we've got the resources to do it, and they don't have the resources to spend a lot on technological innovation and develop, although if they take the line, we're not going to do anything until you guys pay up. I think that needs to be resisted. What's reasonable is that it shouldn't come out of their development, but we can expect them to develop in a way that's green. In a way, this is a so-called problem of historical responsibility, as you probably know, and there's a huge amount of stuff about this. One thing to say, I think, is in a sense, it is right that it's kind of unfair to us that we should be held responsible for causing a problem when, for most of the time, we didn't realize we were causing it. Right? I mean, it's too bad we caused climate change, and until recently, we didn't know we were causing it. But the question is, somebody's going to have to pay a lot to deal with this. Is it fairer that relatively well-off people who in fact contributed more to the problem bear a lot of the burden, or that relatively poor people who didn't contribute to the problem bear the burden? It's sort of unfair that we should have to, but it seems to me even more unfair that they should have to, particularly if it will come out of their development. So, that's on the problem itself. But the main thing, I think, is we need to get out of that argument if possible and get a more kind of forward-looking let's see who can do what. And also we need to try to structure things so that people's contributions pay off for them. One thing I think one can see is if at the national level we're going to fight about this, then it may be what we need to do is let the people who are actually going ahead and trying to do something get together with each other. For example, the official national U.S. position is we don't bear any particular responsibility for this. I went to Bonn and spoke to the negotiators and made the American negotiators furious by sort of endorsing the third world position on this, and they didn't want to hear about it. But meanwhile, the 10 states in the New England region have gotten some an emissions trading program going. There's an emissions trading program going in the EU. So, you know, the U.S. and the Washington, Beijing, and New Delhi can keep fighting about whose fault it is till the cows come home. But maybe meanwhile, the New England regional people and the EU people can start trading emissions permits and get going, and so on and so forth. That is, maybe one thing I think we do need is action at subnational levels among the people who want to do something, and try to escape these imbroglios that the national capitals are in, whatever we all think. I mean, I think the U.S. position is wrong, but I also don't think it's going to change. So ideally, try to get around it.
Yeah, just to try to put in a little broader perspective. So there was a sort of dream that a lot of people had going in the run-up to the Rio Earth Summit and in the years following. And the dream was that the climate process was supposed to be a dynamic process, that the developed countries were going to take the lead in backing down from their high levels of emissions, and then the developing countries would follow. And both patterns of behavior were, to some extent, other-directed, not entirely self-interested, but they were meant in a way to be reciprocal with respect to each other. That dream didn't happen for reasons we can talk about, but in part because not all developed countries did their part, like the United States, and even the ones who did do their part, arguably they didn't do as much as they needed to do. And so we've lost that sense of dynamic optimism that was initially driving this process. And I think we're now in a period in which we are going to try the self-interest route, that nations are basically going to act in the ways that they perceive are in their own self-interest and not go further than that. Now, the really interesting issue is that there's not a single thing that's a national self-interest, nor a single thing that's perceived as a national self-interest, because every country in the world is divided about environmental questions and about how to respond with respect to climate change. Marina da Silva, the Green Party candidate in Brazil, just got 20% of the vote in a presidential election. You can't imagine a radical green candidate like that getting 20% of the vote in the supposedly environmentally oriented countries of the North. So the world is in an extremely fluid position. We'll see what happens when nations shake out their individual policies, and they may come together again in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years in another kind of global regime. But I think the old, as John Lennon once said, the dream is over. We're now in a period in which things are going to get shook up until we see what happens next.
I think one thing to do is to try these lawsuits. I mean, one interesting question here is how much parallel there'll be with to smoking and cancer and so on. I mean, one of the interesting things is a lot of the deniers of climate change are the same guys. I mean, literally the same guys who said that smoking didn't cause cancer. They instead of working for the tobacco companies, they work for the oil companies. But and my understanding is that a lot of suits didn't get anywhere, but finally a suit or two won, and that really made a big difference. Now, I believe it's going to be very hard for anybody to win any of these lawsuits.
Well, as you say, maybe the most important product of the lawsuit is the discovery. Right. You're going to allege conspiracy and so forth, and if you can get far enough along in the litigation and people are willing to finance it, and they're plaintiffs' lawyers who I think now are prepared to finance it. Maybe the stuff you unearth is going to have enough political potency to have the effect, because the litigation alone and whatever could be recovered is not. It's like a catalyst in our political process, as the tobacco litigation was, or people laughed about the litigation against McDonald's, right? Well, that's had a big change, right? Not so much because plaintiffs were winning huge amounts of money, but because it catalyzed this issue in public consciousness, and changes occurred. So.
Well, I think Bill has me right at the normative level, in the sense that I've argued, I think actually in a paper that's reprinted in this book, that even from a consequentialist welfarist point of view, we should become virtue theorists, because it's the nature of these questions that we can't really think about them coherently in those terms, but we have to think about it in some other terms, of which the kind of traditional vocabulary of virtue and character, I think, works better. The other thing that I've been very much influenced by is just all the work in moral psychology that shows that, there's a handful of million philosophers around who think that the only category that's essential to morality is that of harm, and nobody else believes it. And so what happens is that if you try to reconstruct morality strictly in terms of harm production and avoidance in million ways, you really cut yourself off from just a lot of the sort of social and emotional resources that moral terms and moral concepts actually allow you to bring to the discussion. So.
Yeah, you're right. I'm sort of clinging to the old concept and trying to just convince people that it is applicable. Although I do think it's very important not to only say that, and I do think it's important to realize that, think of it in terms of an opportunity to create a really spectacularly wonderful legacy that we're in a box. If we could start creating institutions that got us out of that box, this would be a wonderful thing to do for people, and it would be a wonderful thing to do for them whether or not our failure to do that constituted harm or not. It's a chance. In a way, as Bill knows very well, I used to work a lot on human rights, and I think the kind of basic idea of human right is you realize that there are certain threats that people face. When you're very young, you're very old, you're sick, you're lost, various such circumstances, you become very vulnerable and you can't take care of yourself. Creating institutions that protect rights is creating institutions that enable people to survive these vulnerable periods. What we need to do is to create some institutions that will make the people of the future less vulnerable to all the stuff we've been doing than they are going to be if we don't do that. And so I haven't given up on claiming that right now we're still harming them, but I think probably we all think, and Steve has done interesting stuff on the psychology of this, that whatever is the case about that, it's worth pointing out that we have a chance here to really do something terrific. We blundered into a world in which people are dependent on fossil fuel. Some of you guys should lead the way out of that world into a better world. Whether or not, if you don't, you've harmed anybody.
Dave, do you want to speak to
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I'm in a funny position here because intellectually I have a background in Aristotelian ethics, which is virtue ethics focused. So in a way, I agree with Dale. But I also agree with Henry in a way about this. So the way in which I agree with Dale is I think it's an important moral vocabulary that we have around talking about concerns of character. And that one of the ways to capture and help motivate people around this problem is to say something like, if we engage in the sort of activities we're engaging in with these sorts of results foreseeable in the long term, then we've behaved very badly. I have a paper which I wrote after this volume called "Are We the Scum of the Earth?" and it's sort of investigating. How do you feel about that? How do you really? I'm sort of serious about the question, right? One of the ways of moral evaluation that seems to be important here is, thinking about us, our role as agents, and what you could say what future generations will think about us, and that's one way of articulating. But also what we really think about ourselves if we step back and realize this is what we're doing. But having said all that, so I think there is a distinctive language there that we can use and is quite important for some people at least. Having said that, I'm quite sympathetic to a lot of the things that Henry wants to say about harm, because I think that it's very easy, and it seems to me nothing wrong with saying something like, collectively, we in our generation over time are imposing severe risks on future people. And if those risks are realized, right, then collectively they'll be harmed, and we have harmed them, and that's a central moral wrong. Now, there might be, when you delve into the technicalities, especially at the individual level, that it becomes tricky and you want to say different things. Although John Nolte has a paper where he runs a calculation and says that each American is responsible for harming 2 people in the future.
It's a reductio ad absurdum.
Well, but it's not as though you can. But whatever you say about that, I want to cling, like Henry, to a simple articulation, right? It's hard enough to talk about this problem as it is, I think, so that I'm reluctant to give away certain mainstream moral ways of talking that everybody understands, even if there's some technical reason why we should be a little bit cautious.